and welcome to Inspirations by Dr. Gail. Today's episode is titled The True Story of a White Boy Who Learned He Was Black. This is part 5 of my resiliency series, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons. In this series, I share true stories and practical strategies to help us bounce back from adversity and continue to move forward towards our healthy dreams and goals, no matter who or what comes against us. Have you ever wondered how different your life would have been if you had different parents, attended different schools, and lived in a totally different neighborhood than the one in which you grew up? Have you ever wondered what your life would have been like if you'd been born into a racial group or racial category that is very different from the one that you identify with? What would you do if your world turned upside down overnight? Well, let me explain how one boy handled all of these issues. But instead of starting at the beginning of his story, I'll start in the middle. I first learned about Gregory Howard Williams and his resiliency story during the 1990s. At that time, I was a high school teacher and read his autobiography, Life on the Color Line. This book stirred up so many emotions in me that after reading it, I wrote and sent a letter to Greg. Although he was the dean of Ohio State University's law school, Greg was gracious enough to reply to my letter. Many years later, when I was a college professor at an elite private university in California, I was invited to give a keynote address at the City University of New York. When I finished my speech, I was overwhelmed with joy when I saw Gregory Howard Williams walking down the aisle towards me. I didn't even know that he was in the audience, but because I had followed his career for years and seen photos of him in his autobiography, I definitely knew who he was. At that time, Gregory Howard Williams was the president of the City University of New York. When he reached me, he gave me a big hug, congratulated me on my speech, and shared some updates about his family. By now, you may be thinking, so what's the big deal about all of this? When you hear the following details about Greg's childhood, the answer will become clear to you. These details are included in his autobiography and in YouTube videos of speeches that Greg has given. Greg's life had a very bright beginning. If you look at pictures of him as a child, and if you're familiar with the television sitcom Leave It to Beaver, you'll notice that Greg looked almost identical to Beaver Cleaver, the character played by actor Jerry Mathers. If you aren't familiar with that sitcom, just know that both Greg and Beaver were handsome little boys. During his childhood in Virginia, Greg's immediate family consisted of his father, mother, and 3 younger siblings. According to Greg, quote, "Until age 9, I lived a comfortable life as the son of a wealthy white Virginia restaurant owner. My father's success was enormous. He had a restaurant, a beer tavern, even a septic tank truck, which ironically he won in a crap game. All the trappings of success. In Virginia, my father was the man with the Midas touch. Everything turned to gold. In 1951, he made $50,000, and you don't need to be an economist to know that that was real money in those days. I attended whites-only schools, whites-only skating rinks, and whites-only theaters. At age 9, my life was truly privileged. I bought whatever I wanted whenever I wanted it, and I took all that for granted as part of my birthright. I saw no barriers to my life or to my future, and I felt that I could do or be anything that I wanted to be." Unquote. But there was a lot more to Greg's childhood, for often a parent's professional success can hide what goes on behind closed doors. In this case, although Greg's father was a successful businessman, he also struggled with alcoholism. Soon, this alcoholism led to a chain of events that destroyed Greg's privileged life. Here's how he explained it. "My father's drinking exploded into full-blown alcoholism, and my mother fled in the middle of the night from his beatings, taking a younger brother and a sister and leaving me and my brother Mike behind with my father. I learned to cope with living with an alcoholic. I saw the peaks and valleys of emotion, the contrasting loving and hostile attitudes, and I daily lived the constant turmoil that is part of an alcoholic's family. Up to the time that my mother left, we lived a life of total economic security. 6 months after my mother left, my father lost it all: the restaurant, the tavern, the townhouse, even the septic tank truck. And we ended up ducking and dodging bill collectors and hiding the car from the repo man. Unquote. In addition to the loss of his family's wealth, being abandoned by their mother, and having no interaction with their younger siblings, Greg and his brother Mike experienced a lot of humiliation, neglect, and other traumatic events. When Greg was 10, his father decided that the only option left was to leave Virginia and take his sons to Muncie, Indiana, the place where he'd grown up. He believed that extended family members in Muncie would help him raise his sons. But as he and his sons sat on a Greyhound bus that was headed to Muncie, Indiana, he dropped a bombshell on Greg and Mike that would change their lives more dramatically than the turmoil they'd already experienced. Here's how Greg explained it. As that bus slid across frigid Ohio in the middle of winter, my mind was on Muncie, because I knew that it was the place where I was going to be safe from the savage poverty of Virginia, from having the only meal that I was able to eat in a day being a 25-cent school lunch. So as we headed to Muncie, all my thoughts were ahead of me, not behind. Muncie would be my salvation, and I was certain that my mother's parents would take care of me even if my mother was no longer part of my life. But it was just outside of Dayton that my father leaned across the aisle. "Remember Miss Sally?" he asked. And I did remember her. She was a tall, thin black woman who had floated in and out of our lives, a cook, a maid, not a person of consequence. And my father leaned even closer and in a whisper not to be overheard by the white passengers on the bus said, "She's my mama, and she's your grandmother." I was in a state of absolute shock. The black woman that I thought was our cook was my grandmother, and I never knew it? I resisted, I protested, I refused to believe him. But for the first time I looked closely at my father. He had bronze skin and wavy hair, but Mom had said he was an Italian or Greek. It was all kind of fuzzy. Then memories started to filter back to me, and I began to recall talk about his passing as a Greek boy called Jimmy during the days he spent on the Atlantic City boardwalk in the 1930s. Then in Virginia, he had become Tony Williams, an Italian. It was all kind of interesting. That bus ride that changed my life forever was in January of 1954. It was well before the famous Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education outlawing segregation in America, and I did not want to hear anything about being black because I knew, even at the age of 10, how the rewards and the benefits of America are structured. Life is better if you are white. But try as I might, I was unable to resist the truth of my life and of my heritage. According to the social norms and the laws of America, I was black. And I remember my father's words that afternoon in January of 1954. He said, "Life is going to be different from now on. In Virginia, you were white boys. In Indiana, you're going to be colored boys. But I want you to remember that you aren't any different today than you were yesterday, but people in Indiana will treat you differently." Unquote. Greg's father's words were prophetic, but not necessarily in the ways that he thought they'd be, for it wasn't just classmates and strangers who treated Greg and Mike differently, but family members as well. In Muncie, Greg and Mike were even rejected by both of their grandmothers. According to Greg, quote, "Once my ancestry was discovered, that my father was black, that my grandmother was black, America's one-drop law and custom prevailed. I was treated differently. At first I resented it. I thought I had as much right to be white as my classmates. But try as I might to be white, Muncie was a divided place, and there was always someone willing to police those boundaries and to reward merit only if the achiever was white. In the midst of all this hostility and rejection, my brother Mike and I tried to reach out to our white relatives in Muncie for a lifeline, for hope. And we pleaded with my mother's mother, my white grandmother, to take a message of our suffering to our mother, only to be rebuffed by her curt response that she didn't carry messages for Niggers, unquote. By the way, Greg didn't spell the word. I spelled it. Regarding his paternal grandmother, Greg said, there had been no joyous reunion with Grandma Sally when we stood penniless and broken at the door of her tar paper shack at 601 and a half Railroad Street. She was angry. She had been denied by her son, by her daughter-in-law, and my brother and I were found guilty by her of being co-conspirators. And we were the ones offered up to pay the debt of humiliation and desertion that she had suffered from my family, unquote. In Muncie, Greg and Mike were not only rejected by family members and schoolmates, but they continued to live in poverty. Things were so bad that in order to eat, they had to pick discarded fruit from the trash behind a fruit market and eat meat that was thrown into dumpsters by a butcher. But during this very sad period in Greg's life, an acquaintance of his grandma Sally decided to take action. Miss Dora was a 52-year-old black widow who had an 8th grade education. Even though she worked as a domestic and received no public assistance to help with the boys, she chose to become their unofficial foster mother. And through her many acts of kindness, Miss Dora became the turnaround adult, that positive role model that Greg desperately needed to change his life course from one of poverty, rejection, and despair to a highly successful one. According to Greg, quote, for most of us, there is someone who reached out to us, and in some cases, that person saved our lives. And my brother and I had our Savior in the form of someone who understood injustice but lived commitment. Dora W. Terry came into our lives as we struggled. Today, when I think about her, tears come to my eyes. She had virtually nothing, but she was willing to share all that she had with us. And with no thought of reward or recognition, she took us into her home and made us her family. She took my brother and me by the hand and gave us a home, gave us love, and gave us affection. Often, I am asked how a mixed-race boy growing up in abject poverty, shunned by both blacks and whites, could earn 5 college degrees and end up as dean of a major law school. And there's only one answer to that question, and that's Miss Dora. While I learned many great things pursuing my education and during 25 years of teaching, my most important lessons in life were learned from her. The one character trait that has carried me farthest is commitment. And I learned commitment from watching her walk to her job as a domestic 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And she made that trek in winter and in summer and in good weather and in bad, whether she was sick or not, because she knew 2 little boys absolutely depended upon her. And though she owed us nothing, she willingly accepted responsibility of being our mother. She was a marked contrast to my father, who always exhorted me in his bombastic, alcohol-laced oratorical tones. Never sell yourself cheaply, son. Your labor is all you have to give. And while I marveled at his oratory, he never had much staying power, especially at the menial, mundane jobs that were standard for Muncie's blacks. But Miss Dora knew that the coins tossed her way were what made the difference between starvation and survival for my brother and me. In the vernacular of our times, my dad talked the talk, but Miss Dora was the one that walked the walk, and that made all the difference. It was Miss Dora who stared adversity in the face and did not shrink from it. She did not become angry and bitter. God gave her a large heart. Her goal was simple: make life a little easier for two little boys. Unquote. Gregory Howard Williams' story is an excellent example of resiliency and the power of one turnaround adult to change the life course of a hurting child. Because of Miss Dora's sacrifices and powerful impact, in addition to becoming a husband and father, Greg became a deputy sheriff, earned numerous degrees, wrote books and articles, became a professor, became dean of a law school, and served as the president of 2 universities. In spite of Greg's success, some of his family members and friends did not turn out so well. Here's how Greg summarized it. Quote, I lost many of my boyhood friends from the projects of my youth to drugs, to alcohol, to violence, and to just plain poverty and indifference. And while I thank God for my fortune, I ache for those who hoped for a better life but were unable to find it. Many of my friends from Muncie could not deal with the poverty, the racism, and the adversity they experienced. Unfortunately, my father, while he had hoped for me, lacked traits to stand up to the adversity he encountered, and he succumbed to a life of alcohol. My grandmother Sally directed her anger at my brother and me for the injustice she felt that she had suffered from my family, and she showed her 2 grandchildren little love because of the cloud of anger which consumed her. Also, in the face of adversity, my mother's mother, my white grandmother, would not cross Muncie's racial barrier to comfort her own grandchildren. She could not conquer her racism and her prejudice, not even to reach out to her own flesh and blood. My black grandmother and my white grandmother lived within 2 miles of each other, yet, though they lived to advanced ages, they never ever spoke to one another. Greg also said, we all face adversity to some degree, but I've learned that it's how we choose to face adversity in our lives that shapes who we are. I have seen family and friends become bitter, angry, and broken. I have seen fortune won and lost. And I have felt the pain of separation and alienation, and I saw one humble woman rise to the challenge. When Miss Dora endured the scorn of her friends and relatives and took in 2 black boys who appeared to be white, she did not say that people are happiest with their own kind. She did not say that she lacked time or money. She just did it. Unquote. In his autobiography and the speeches that he gives, Greg makes it quite clear that Miss Dora is the true hero of his resiliency story because of the choice that she made to rescue Greg and Mike when others turned their backs on them. And the main point that I hope that you'll take away from this episode of Inspirations by Dr. Gale is all about choices. Here's that main point. No matter who we are, how we look, or the type of background that we come from, throughout our lifetime, each of us will experience various types of adversity. This adversity may include financial problems, health challenges, racism, other forms of injustice, rejection, or some other type of problem. But even though many circumstances are out of our control, when faced with challenges, we have choices. We can become angry, bitter, vengeful, and hateful, or we can choose to keep moving forward towards our healthy dreams and goals, no matter who or what comes against us. Stay tuned for the Personal Growth Challenge. This episode's Personal Growth Challenge consists of 5 exercises that I hope you'll include in your personal growth notebook, or journal. And if you're new to this podcast, I urge you to keep a personal growth notebook or journal for all of the personal growth challenges that I share. Number 1, make a list of the 3 biggest challenges that you're currently facing, and next to each challenge, list the choices or options that you can use to address the challenge. Number 2, write the pros and cons of using each choice or option that you wrote, and then decide which choice is the best option for each challenge and explain the specific actions or steps that you'll take to address each challenge. Number 3, list any negative mindsets that you have about your own racial identity and explain how you'll address these negative mindsets so that they won't keep you from pursuing your healthy dreams and goals. Number 4, list any negative mindsets that have prevented you from having healthy relationships with individuals from racial backgrounds that differ from your own. For example, if you're a teacher, how have you treated students who come from different racial backgrounds than your own? What about classmates, co-workers, neighbors, and mixed-race family members? How have you treated them? How have your mindsets prevented you from having healthy relationships with them? And then explain the actions that you'll take in order to improve your relations with these individuals. Number 5, list 3 to 5 people in your network who could benefit from hearing this particular episode of Inspirations by Dr. Gail, and please share it with your network. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you'll tune in next time to hear When Grief Comes. This is part 6 of my resiliency series, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons. For more information about Inspirations by Gail LLC, including how you can book me for a speaking engagement and find out about the professional development and other empowerment services that I offer to schools, universities, businesses, and religious organizations, please visit my website, www.drgailthompson.com. That's www.drgailt as in Thompson, HOMP as in Paul, SON.com. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to this podcast through my website, or you can do this through my YouTube channel, Inspirations by Gail. And please remember to hit that like button and tell your networks about this podcast. If you're interested in the theme music for this podcast, please check out music by Aaron Nimbus through Apple Music. In the meantime, please remember this. No matter who we are, how we look, or the type of background that we came from, throughout our lifetime, each of us will experience various types of adversity. This adversity may include financial problems, health problems, racism, other forms of injustice, rejection, or some other problem. But even though many circumstances are totally out of our control, when faced with challenges, we have choices. We can become angry, bitter, vengeful, and hateful, or we can choose to keep moving forward towards our healthy dreams and goals, no matter who or what comes against us. Until next time, hugs and blessings. I'm Dr. Gail L. Thompson.